And on that note, if while I'm speaking, any of you want to get up and have a glass of water, feel free to. So this is the art of thinking about God. This is our second session we've done. And you have to excuse me, I'm getting over a bit of a cold, but the art of thinking about God is a session where we will go over an argument in philosophy of religion. And normally arguments in philosophy of religion are quite complex, which is why if you can understand one and understand why you agree or disagree with it, after that understanding, you wind up knowing a lot more about what you thought about philosophy of religion than before you began the endeavor, which is why arguments in philosophy of religion are an incredible thing to be able to try and get your head around, because they are a way of understanding more about what you think about these issues in philosophy of religion. And an environment where people can discuss what they think about arguments regarding God is a wonderful thing, especially in a place like the secular society, which is a wonderful thing in Leicester, which I would encourage all of you to join if you have not already. So the argument tonight that we're going to be looking at is the teleological argument for the existence of God. And for those of you who were here last week, this is going to be different from the cosmological argument, which is we did last time, because the teleological argument is that features of the universe's complexity imply the universe was designed by a creator. Now that's very different from the cosmological argument, because the cosmological argument says that the mere existence of the universe is evidence of a creator, whereas the teleological argument says that some element of the universe's complexity makes it more likely than not that the universe was designed by a creator. So teleological arguments are inductive rather than deductive, whereas cosmological arguments tend to be deductive. Now, what's the difference? When an argument is deductive, it has to do with claims for which there is 100% certainty. Like, a deductive argument would be, if I am a man, I am human, I am a man, therefore I am a human. Because in all of those inferences, if the inferences are right, they're right 100%. Whereas an inductive argument deals with probability. So it's claims for which, even if the claims are true, it's only more likely than not that they're true. For instance, the claim that the sun will rise tomorrow. That's not a claim for which we can have 100% accuracy, but it's a claim for which we can have a good deal of probability. And so it's an inductive claim rather than a deductive claim. So teleological arguments, especially the ones that we're discussing tonight, are inductive rather than deductive. Now, the original version of the teleological argument that's had a huge impact on Western civilization and religion and so on, which some of you may have heard of, was a product of William Paley's mind. And the version of the teleological argument that Paley came up with was what you would call an analogical inductive argument. Now, what is an analogical inductive argument? It's an inductive argument that attempts to show that something is more likely than not because of an analogy between something we observe and the thing that we're trying to show is the case. So the way that Paley's inductive analogical argument worked in this case was Paley would, okay, how can we look at features of the university's complexity and infer from them that it's more likely than not that God existed? Those complex features were created and designed by God. So Paley comes up with a thought experiment. He says, okay, imagine you're on a beach. You're walking along the sandy beach. You walk, and then you see on the floor, there's a watch. You pick up the watch, you observe all the things that make it a watch. You see that it's a machine, you see that it has coils, you see that it tells time. Do you infer that this was a product of random things happening over time? For instance, say, sand coming up and down the beach over and over again over millions of years? Or do you think this watch is a created object? Well, Paley says you're going to think, of course, this object is created. It has all the features of design, whereas sand granules that surround it, they do not. So he infers from that. He says, okay, just as we can infer that a watch on a beach has a designer, we can infer that the universe has a designer, because the universe, to an even greater extent than the watch, seems like it has purposes attached to it. It seems like it has order. It seems like it has certain mechanical functions that are even more complex and more precise in their aims than a watch has. So from that, Paley thinks that just from observing the natural world, you can infer that it's more likely than not that it was designed by God. Now, the problem with Paley's argument was that he had two major obstacles, which he never really overcame throughout the centuries. Obstacles towards people accepting this argument. The first was the criticisms that David Hume made of Paley's argument in the dialogues concerning natural religion. And the second problem was Darwin's theory of evolution. Now, how was Darwin's theory of evolution a problem for Paley's argument? Well, the problem with the theory of evolution was it was an account of biology, which over time has become the account of biology that all biology seems to hinge on, right? But in this account, you have things which have order and design coming out of randomness over time. So that seemed to be a huge blow against all of the intuitions that Paley had about how order is something that only comes out of created objects with designers. And the second problem for Paley's argument were the two critiques that Hume gave of this argument. The first of Hume's critique is that because this is an analogical argument that Paley's giving, if we're going to be completely consistent, we would say, look, when we pick up the watch on the beach and we look at the watch, we don't say this was created by one person. We say, given all the different kinds of interworkings in the watch, it was probably created by many creators. So if we're going to extend the same reasoning to the universe, actually what we wind up getting is not the existence of God, but the existence of gods. We get polytheism. And that's not what Paley had intentioned. The second critique that Hume gives of Paley is that if we look at machines, like watches for instance, we notice that they're imperfect. And because machines are imperfect, that's an indication that the creator of the machine must also be imperfect. So because we can notice ways in which the universe isn't perfect, that must mean that if it has a creator, the creator must also be imperfect. Again, that's not what Paley wanted to be a conclusion of his argument, because he wasn't trying to argue for polytheism, and he wasn't arguing for an imperfect God. And the entire theory of evolution cast out on the very intuition that Paley was relying on to give this blind watchmaker argument. So what we've seen since Hume and since Darwin, especially in the 20th century, is attempts to rehabilitate the teleological argument without doing the version of it, which was based on an analogy that Paley did. So if we look at the modern versions of the teleological argument, they still tend to be inductive without being based on analogies so much. So for example, the most famous teleological argument of the early 20th century, which came from George Tenet, it wasn't based on analogies, it was based on an argument from explanation. Now, what is an explanatory argument? An explanatory inductive argument is when you say, look, there's a variety of different ways of explaining a phenomenon, but one way of explaining that phenomenon is the best way. Therefore, it's more probable that that explanation is true. So for Tenet, right, Tenet thought that God's existence is the best explanation of 6 features of the universe. So the first was the intelligibility of the world to the human mind. The second was the adaptation of living organisms to their living environment. The third was the ways in which the inorganic world is conducive to the emergence and maintenance of human and animal life. The fourth was the beauty of nature. The fifth was the ways in which the world is conducive to the moral development of human beings. And 6 is the overall progression of the evolutionary process. So what's important about Tenet's teleological argument is that whether or not you accept it, this style of argument became the basis of most of the teleological arguments that you see today. Most of the ones that you see today are inductive teleological arguments that are in some way doing a variation on Tenet, where they try to isolate some features of the universe's complexity and show how this feature makes it more probable that God exists. And probably the most famous one in the last 40 or 50 years has been the anthropic principle style of teleological argument. So anthropic principle teleological arguments are a cluster of arguments, but they all have the same theme. So what they're all trying to show is that in order for light to exist today, an incredibly restrictive set of demands had to be met early on in the universe. So these demands typically include, in order for us to exist, for instance, way at the beginning of the universe, there had to be a very specific rate of expansion, a very specific amount of matter, a very specific gravitational constant, a very specific strong force constant, very specific isotropic distributions of matter and radiation, very specific ratios of matter to antimatter, and a very specific presence of stable elements heavier than helium. So all anthropic principle teleological arguments today in some way try and show that because of the conditions that were necessary to create life way back at the origin of the universe, the fact that these conditions were met is somehow evidence that it's more likely than not that God put them there. So this is kind of the most famous teleological argument that gets used over and over again in different variations throughout the late 20th and early 21st century. But actually what we'll be looking at today, in some ways, is a bit more of an idiosyncratic teleological argument, which comes from the philosopher Richard Taylor. And this is going to be what's called an epistemological teleological argument. Now, what does that mean? It means that when something is epistemological, it has to do with knowledge. So this is an argument that tries to show that because of the way that knowledge works, it's more probable than not that God exists. That's the consideration that it's going to be primarily banking on. It's not so much anything having to do with astrophysics, like the other ones. So this is an epistemological teleological argument, and it's based on a philosophical intuition that the philosopher Richard Taylor had at some point, I think in the early 60s. And what's fascinating about this argument is it's not really a religious argument. It's kind of a secular teleological argument. In that Richard Taylor doesn't care if you come away from this argument thinking that God is imperfect, or that there's more than one God, or that God doesn't have the attributes that he supposedly has in the Bible. All that he's trying to establish with this argument is that the universe as we know it has design, and we can know that it has design based on epistemological considerations. So what's the main intuition that Taylor's using in this argument? The main intuition is that when physical objects help us to have a metaphysical understanding of reality independently of ourselves, those objects are designed. So this argument hinges on a thought experiment. So suppose you're walking along somewhere on the border between England and Wales, and upon crossing into Wales, you look down and you see a group of stones, and they're all arranged in a way where there's a sign, and the sign says, "Welcome to Wales!" exclamation mark. Now, Taylor thinks, of course you can look at that and think it has nothing to do with where you are. You can think like it tells you nothing about where you are. For all you know, you could be in Japan. But he says, if you trust the sign, the reason you're trusting it is because it has the markers of design. So for Taylor, when you look at the sign that says "Welcome to Wales," you're not just getting pure information out of it. You're getting something metaphysical out of it. That is, it's telling you where you are, and it's telling you something about the character of the world outside of you. That is, it's telling you that at this moment in time, given where you are, the world outside of you, in your immediate vicinity, is Wales. And for Taylor, what this means is the reason the stones can do that is because they have the markers of design. If you thought that they didn't tell you they were in Wales, that's fine. But if you did trust the stones to tell you you really were in Wales, that's because the stones have the markers of design. Because the only things that we know of in the world which tell us accurate metaphysical information about things outside of us are designed objects. And it turns out that we ourselves, with our eyes, with our sensory organs, our sensitivity to temperature and touch and so on, that we're also physical objects. And so for Taylor, in order for us to trust our own senses, we have to treat our senses as if they were designed objects. Because if they were not designed objects, we couldn't rely on our senses any more than we could rely on a collection of random stones. So that's the basic intuition of Taylor's argument. Here's the specific form of the argument. It's a very simple two-premise and a conclusion argument. Whenever you see an argument with premises and conclusion, for those of you who don't know, the premises just are the reasons for the conclusion. So what are the premises in this case? Well, for Taylor, the first premise is epistemological realism is rational. What does that mean? What is epistemological realism? Epistemological realism is very simple. It just means if I see you, you're really out there. If I were an anti-realist, I would say in some way I'm seeing you, but there's some sense in which you're not really out there. That maybe my mind is constructing you as much as the molecules that consist of you are actually giving me information about who you are. There's all kinds of different ways that we can be anti-realist. But if we're an epistemological realist, that means that we believe that if we see things out there, those things are really out there. So the first premise is that epistemological realism is rational. Now, why does Taylor believe that? Well, because he seems to think that if we thought that epistemological realism wasn't rational, we couldn't do science. So we have to trust that when we see things, they're really out there, or else there'd be no point in doing any kind of science. What about the second premise? The second premise is a person's assertion of epistemological realism is rational if and only if the person is justified in asserting that our faculties of sense and cognition are designed to reveal the existence and nature of an independently existing world. Okay, what does he mean by that? He means we can only be epistemological realists. We can only assume that what you see really is out there if we think that the senses that we have, the physiology of our bodies, are capable of accurately telling us information about a mind-independent world which exists exterior to us, right? And from those two premises, it gets to the conclusion, it's rational to believe our faculties of sense and cognition are designed to reveal the existence and nature of an independently existing world. And the reason that conclusion follows is that for Taylor, if we couldn't assume that our senses were designed to be able to give us accurate information, there's no reason why we should trust them. The only reason why we trust them enough to interact in a way where we presuppose them is because on some level we're implicitly assuming that these are well-designed instruments that tell us what's really out there and not just how things out there appear to us. So that's Taylor's teleological argument. Now before we discuss this bit, I want to first ask you, do you have any questions about this argument? Like, do you understand how it flows, or do you have any clarifications? Yes? Does everyone think they understand?
Right.
Yes?
Okay, what about illusions?
Illusions?
Yes, I mean, because then you're seeing something that's not real. You know, holograms and things like that.
Okay, so this is an interesting question. How would Taylor deal with optical illusions, for instance? He would say that the total set of experiences that we have with our eyes give us indications of what things we see that are illusions and which things that are not. And that's the very reason we can differentiate between the two, which is ipso facto evidence that our eyes show us things external to us. Yes?
Okay, what I'm saying is I think obviously the brain interprets information, and so, but we actually don't know if what we are seeing is how it is, because, for example, cats and dogs can hear sounds that we can't hear. We have no idea what the reality actually is other than how we perceive it. And some people perceive things in different ways due to brain injury or neurological divergence, like autism and things like that. So we can never know what really is out there. Like some people, for example, can smell colour and things like that, or things they see, they've got more receptors in their brains than the average person, so they see colours more differentiated and bright. Do you know what I mean? We don't really know what's out there, but we can only see what our brains are telling us, what we're receiving and interpreting, processing.
Interesting. So are you expressing a skepticism about epistemological realism in the first place?
Yes, I'm saying you can't assume that what we see is real.
Well, what's interesting about that is Taylor would say, okay, I haven't argued for one, really. So if you reject one, that's fine. All I'm saying is that if you accept the idea that things are external to us, and that our eyes give us evidence of things that are really out there, then you have to accept that the eye is a created object with a designer.
I do believe that eyes are created and designed, but I don't believe that we can know 100% that what we see is reality.
Interesting. Yes?
He seems to have jumped straight over Darwin and said that our faculties are designed. You could equally well put the word evolved into design. And in fact, there's evidence for evolved, and I don't know how much evidence has got for design.
Okay, so, pardon me, so you think perhaps one of the problems with Taylor's argument is he's assuming that the term evolved can't do the same explanatory work that design can do.
Why not?
Now, one of the interesting things about this argument is it's not quite clear what he means by design. So it's not quite clear how different what he calls design is from evolution. You could interpret him as saying evolution is the designer. But then it seems like he's attributing to evolution properties that at least typically evolution doesn't have.
Design does imply a designer,
Yes.
whereas evolution is supposed to be an interaction of randomness of DNA and the environment.
Well, the
Right.
selection criteria.
Yes, selection, yes. Lots of selection criteria.
Right.
Where's the environment come
So,
from?
well,
Where's the DNA come from?
what did you say?
You're saying that evolution is the combination of the environment and DNA,
Right.
but where has the DNA come from and where has the environment come from?
Well, that's a different argument. That's the cosmological argument again. But the question is, can you describe evolution in a way where evolution itself is a kind of designer?
Yes.
That has a purpose and that functions in a way where it's almost like a being, even though it's not.
Well, it doesn't have to have purpose, but evolution will work on the basis of, well, natural selection at the end of the day. In other words, natural selection is the designer.
Yes. Yes?
I don't think there is any purpose in evolution. Evolution is a product of a life form interacting with its environment through natural selection, chance mutations, we get favourable. So if we visit a planet where we discover it's got life, if it survives